Just after dawn on November 5th, 2025, hundreds of police officers moved through Hamburg, Berlin, and the state of Hesse at the exact same moment. They forced open apartment doors, carried out boxes of seized computers and handwritten notes, and froze bank accounts. By the time most of the country had finished its coffee, an entire organization had legally ceased to exist. Its name was Muslim Interactive. Germany's Interior Ministry said it was a nest of extremists demanding a caliphate on German soil. But to a lot of young Muslims watching the raids play out on their phones that morning, it looked like something very different. It looked like the state had reached for the law and used it against them once again. And that one word, again, is where this whole story actually starts. Before we get into it, if you like deep dives into how power, law, and religion collide in modern Europe, take a second and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one. Now let's go back to that morning in Hamburg. The numbers from that day tell you how serious Germany was. 7 properties searched in Hamburg alone, 12 more across Berlin and Hesse. 19 locations in total hit almost simultaneously, so nobody could warn anyone else. Police walked out of a raided apartment in the Mühlmannsberg district carrying evidence bags in broad daylight, and the photographs went everywhere within hours. The Interior Ministry did not just investigate Muslim Interactive, it banned the group outright, dissolved it as a legal entity, confiscated its assets, and pulled its websites offline. By the afternoon, if you tried to visit the group's pages, there was nothing there. The organization had been erased from the internet by government order. The man who signed off on all of it was Alexander Dobrindt, Germany's interior minister. And he did not choose his words carefully to soften the blow. He said that anyone who takes to German streets to aggressively demand that the country become a caliphate, who incites hatred against Jews and the state of Israel, and who tramples on the rights of women and minorities, would be met with the full force of the law. He accused Muslim Interactive of trying to attack the country from within. This was not framed as a quiet, administrative decision. It was framed as a defense of the nation. So who exactly was Muslim Interactive? And how did a group most Germans had never heard of end up at the center of a nationwide police operation? Here's the part that made them genuinely difficult for the government to handle. Muslim Interactive was not some underground cell hiding in a basement. It was a media operation. The group was known for a slick, fast-moving online presence, the kind of short vertical videos that rack up views before you even realize what you are watching. They spoke directly to young Muslims in Germany, especially the ones who felt alienated, watched, or unwelcome in a country where they were a minority. The Interior Minister of Hamburg, Andy Grote, had a name for it. He called it modern TikTok Islamism, and that phrase captures the problem precisely. This was extremism that understood the algorithm. To understand why the government treated a group of online creators as a national security matter, you have to understand how their content actually worked. They did not open with talk of a caliphate. They opened with grievance, and grievance is easy to agree with. A video might begin with a real headline about discrimination, a real story about a Muslim woman turned down for a job over her headscarf, a real clip of a politician saying something ugly, all of it true, all of it relatable. And then, once the viewer was already nodding along, the message would quietly pivot. The problem, the video would suggest, was not this or that unfair policy. The problem was democracy itself, and the solution was not better laws. It was God's law. That slow slide from a legitimate complaint everyone can share to a total rejection of the entire system is exactly what made them dangerous in the eyes of the state. They were not recruiting with anger alone. They were recruiting with truth and then bending it a few degrees at a time. The moment that put them on the map came in May of 2024. Muslim Interactive organized a demonstration in Hamburg that drew around 1,000 people into the streets. The banners were not vague. They spoke of Germany as a place that needed to be redeemed, and they held up the caliphate as the answer. For a country that watches public calls to overthrow its democratic order with deadly seriousness, that rally was a line being crossed in public, on camera, in the middle of a major city. German security services had already been watching the group. After that day, the watching turned into a countdown. Germany's domestic intelligence agencies believed Muslim Interactive was not really an independent local group at all. They classified it as part of a much older and much larger movement called Hizb ut-Tahrir. That name matters because Hizb ut-Tahrir has been banned in Germany since January of 2003, more than 20 years ago, over accusations that it promoted violence and hatred against Jews. The United Kingdom went further and formally designated it a terrorist organization in 2024. So, in the government's eyes, this was not a new problem. It was an old, prohibited ideology that had simply found a new, younger, more camera-friendly face. The official case against Muslim Interactive rested on the German constitution itself. The ministry argued the group pursued anti-constitutional aims, that it rejected the basic principles of democracy and the rule of law, that it spread anti-Semitism, and that it was openly hostile to gender equality and to the rights of sexual minorities. The most serious charge was ideological. The government said the group promoted Islamic law as the only legitimate model for society, and insisted that this religious law should take precedence over German law, including in how women are treated. In a democracy built on the idea that the Constitution sits above everything else, that claim is not a debate. It is a threat. There is also a specific and painful backdrop to the timing here. After the Hamas attacks on Israel in October of 2023 and the war that followed in Gaza, Germany saw a sharp rise in anti-Semitic incidents and in aggressive demonstrations on its streets. For a country whose entire post-war identity is built on the words "never again," open hatred of Jews in public is not treated as ordinary political speech. It is treated as an emergency. Groups that appeared to celebrate the attacks or that turned protest into calls for the destruction of Israel and open contempt for Jewish life moved straight to the top of the government's threat list. Muslim Interactive, in the government's account, was squarely part of that wave, so the crackdown did not fall out of a clear sky. It grew directly out of the single most sensitive nerve in all of German public life. And plenty of people agreed with the ban, including people you might not expect. Ahmad Mansour, one of Germany's best-known campaigners against Islamist extremism, a man of Arab background who has spent years working on exactly this issue, wrote publicly that Dobrindt was right and that the ban was necessary. He described Muslim Interactive as part of a network that had grown noticeably more aggressive and more dangerous in recent months, a network that ran intimidation campaigns and deliberately targeted young people to pull them into its ideology. When a critic of both the far right and of Islamist extremism looks at a group and says, yes, this one had to be stopped, that carries weight. So on the surface, this looks clean. A democracy identified an extremist group that wanted to replace its laws with a caliphate, and it shut that group down using the tools the law provides. Case closed. Except it is not that simple. Because remember that word from the very beginning. Again. This is where we have to talk about the pattern, because Muslim Interactive was not the first door the German state kicked in, and everyone involved knew it. Rewind about 16 months to July of 2024. On that day, German authorities banned a very different kind of organization, the Islamic Center Hamburg. This was not a scrappy social media group run by 20-somethings. It was one of the oldest and most established Islamic institutions in the entire country. Founded back in 1953 by Iranian immigrants, it ran the famous Blue Mosque on the shores of Hamburg's Alster Lake, a landmark building known across Germany. When the ban came down, more than 50 properties were searched across 8 German states, and 4 Shiite mosques were ordered shut. An institution that had stood for over 70 years was dissolved in a single morning. The government's reasoning was that the Islamic Center Hamburg was not really the peaceful religious body it presented itself as. Officials accused it of being a direct outpost of Iran's supreme leader on German soil, of spreading Tehran's ideology aggressively, and of supporting Hezbollah, which Germany had already banned from operating in the country back in 2020. The then Interior Minister, Nancy Faeser, called it an Islamist, extremist, totalitarian ideology opposed to human dignity, to women's rights, and to an independent judiciary. But Faeser said something else that day, and it is the single most important sentence in this entire story. She looked at the cameras and stated plainly that the government was not taking action against a religion. She drew a hard line, in her words, between the Islamist extremists being cracked down on and the many Muslims who belong to Germany and live peacefully by their faith. She insisted the ban did not touch the peaceful practice of the Shiite religion at all. In other words, the government saw the danger. It saw exactly how this could look, and it went out of its way on the record to say this is about extremism, not about Islam. So now, stack it up. Hizb ut-Tahrir banned in 2003. The Islamic Center Hamburg and its network of mosques banned in 2024. Muslim Interactive banned in 2025, with two more groups, Generation Islam and Realitat Islam, raided and under investigation on the very same day. 3 federal states, 19 properties in a single coordinated strike. That is the pattern. That is the again. And it did not stop at individual bans. When Germany's new governing coalition of Christian Democrats and Social Democrats took power in 2025, their agreement included a decision to make the government's task force on Islamism prevention a permanent standing body inside the Interior Ministry, charged with drawing up national plans to combat what they call Islamism. This was no longer a one-off response to one bad group. It was becoming permanent machinery. And around the same period, Germany's highest court upheld rules barring Muslim trainee lawyers from wearing the headscarf while representing the state in court, on the grounds that the judiciary must appear religiously neutral. Different issue, different branch of government, but the same underlying question kept surfacing. Where exactly does the German state draw the line around Islam in public life? For a lot of ordinary Muslims in Germany, watching all of this unfold, the message did not feel narrow and surgical. It felt broad. It felt like a drumbeat. And this is the other side of the story, the side the government's clean version leaves out. Germany is home to somewhere around 5.5 million Muslims. That is roughly 1 in every 15 people living in the country. The largest communities trace their roots to Turkey, to Kazakhstan, to Syria. These are not extremists. They are workers, students, doctors, shopkeepers, grandparents, kids who were born in Germany and know it as the only home they have ever had. To understand how those 5.5 million people got there in the first place, you have to go back to the early 1960s. West Germany was booming and desperately short of workers, so it signed labor recruitment deals with a string of countries. In 1961, it signed the big one, with Turkey. Hundreds of thousands of Turkish workers arrived to run the factories and rebuild a shattered economy. They were called guest workers, in German, Gastarbeiter, on the polite assumption that one day they would simply go home. Most of them never did. They stayed, they married, they raised children, and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren are now as German as anyone in Berlin. That is the deep root of the country's Muslim population. It did not arrive last year on a boat, the way the loudest voices online love to pretend. It has been part of the German story for more than 60 years, and when they see dawn raids, dissolved organizations, permanent task forces with the word Islamism stamped on the door, and headscarf bans working their way through the courts, some of them do not feel protected. They feel suspected. Critics of the crackdown argue that Germany is quietly widening its definition of the enemy. Researchers at the Bridge Initiative, based at Georgetown University, have argued that making the Islamism Task Force permanent is one more step in what they describe as the criminalization of ordinary Muslim civic activity. Their concern is that the target is drifting. It started with groups that openly praised violence, but over the years, the language shifted towards something German officials call legalistic Islamism, meaning non-violent, organized religious groups that work entirely within the democratic system, follow the law, and simply hold conservative religious views. When the state builds permanent machinery to monitor a religion's non-violent organizations, critics ask, where does the monitoring actually end? And the fear is not abstract. When your mosque's finances get scrutinized, when your community association has to stop and wonder whether attending a protest might one day get it labeled, when a permanent government body exists specifically to study your religion for signs of danger, the ordinary business of belonging to a faith starts to feel like it happens under a spotlight. Being permanently observed changes how it feels to pray, to organize, and to speak your mind even when you have done nothing wrong. That quiet, chilling effect, critics argue, is a real cost the government almost never counts when it tallies up another ban. And here is the genuinely uncomfortable part, the part that makes this so hard to untangle. Muslim Interactive understood this fear perfectly, and it fed on it. Hamburg's own intelligence service noted that the group's leaders deliberately used their videos to push a single message to young Muslims, that German politics and German society had already rejected the entire Muslim community, that they would never be accepted, so they should stop trying to belong. Every raid, every ban, every headline could be repackaged into that narrative. See, the intelligence report essentially said, "They told you Germany hates you. And now look, the state just proved us right." That is the trap, and it is a vicious one. The extremists needed young Muslims to feel persecuted because persecution was their entire recruiting pitch. So every time the state cracked down, it risked handing the extremists exactly the story they wanted and pushing the alienated kids in the audience one step closer to the very ideology the ban was meant to defeat. Act too softly, and you let a group that calls for a caliphate keep radicalizing teenagers on social media. Act too hard, and you validate that group's central lie to millions of innocent people caught in the middle. There is no clean move on that board, which brings us back to the law itself and to why Germany reaches for these bans in the first place. Germany does not treat freedom of association as absolute the way some countries do. Written into the very foundation of the modern German state, into Article 9 of its basic law, is a provision that allows the government to ban organizations whose aims or activities run against the constitutional order or against the idea of peaceful international understanding. Paired with the country's law on associations, that gives the Interior Ministry a genuinely sharp tool. It can dissolve an organization by administrative order without first winning a long criminal trial. This is the mechanism that took down Muslim Interactive and the Islamic Center Hamburg and Hizb ut-Tahrir before them. And these bans are not the last word from a single minister with nobody watching over him. Groups that get dissolved can and do fight back in court. When Hizb ut-Tahrir was banned back in 2003, it challenged the decision all the way up the ladder. Germany's Federal Administrative Court rejected the appeal. The country's highest constitutional court declined to take the case. And when the group finally turned to the European Court of Human Rights, it lost there too. The German model is not one politician making an organization disappear by decree. It is a decision that has repeatedly survived review by independent judges at home and across Europe. For the people who support the crackdown, that judicial track record is the single strongest piece of evidence they have that these are lawful security measures and not religious persecution dressed up in legal language. There is a name for the philosophy behind this. Germans call it Wehrhafte Demokratie, a democracy capable of defending itself. It was built deliberately out of the ashes of the 1930s, when the country watched its own fragile democracy get voted and intimidated out of existence from within. In 1933, a democratically elected government handed near total power to Adolf Hitler, and the institutions that were supposed to stop him simply folded. Legal parties, legal newspapers, and legal associations became the very vehicles that carried a dictatorship into power, all of it more or less within the rules of the old system. When Germany rebuilt itself after the war, it was determined never to be that naive again. So it wrote self-defense directly into its new constitution and handed the state the authority to move against the enemies of democracy before they could get their hands on the machinery of the state. Every ban Germany issues today, whether against a neo-Nazi cell or an Islamist group, flows downstream from that one searing memory. The lesson Germany took from that catastrophe was blunt. A democracy that is too tolerant of the movements trying to destroy it will not survive them. So the modern German state gave itself the power to strike first at groups it deems anti-constitutional. And that is the crucial detail the angriest version of this story always leaves out. This machinery was not built for Islam, it was built against Nazism, and Germany still uses it that way. In the very same years it has been banning Islamist groups, it has also been banning and prosecuting neo-Nazi networks and far-right extremist organizations using the same law and the same logic. Over that same stretch of time, Germany dissolved far-right clubs, cracked down on a network of so-called Reichsbürger who reject the legitimacy of the modern German state entirely, and broke up a genuinely alarming plot by extremists who wanted to storm the parliament building and topple the government by force. The domestic intelligence service that keeps watch on Islamist groups keeps watch on the far right just as intently, and by many of its own measures, it treats right-wing extremism as the single largest violent threat the country faces. None of that ever makes it into a headline that reads, Germany versus Islam. But it is essential context because it is the entire difference between a state that is hunting one religion and a state that is hunting anti-constitutional movements wherever they happen to grow. The tool is not aimed at a faith. It is aimed, at least on paper, at anyone who wants to tear down the constitutional order from any direction. So, was this a law used against Islam or a law used against extremists who happen to invoke Islam? That is the fault line this entire debate is balanced on, and where you stand on it depends a lot on where you are standing. If you are Alexander Dobrindt or Nancy Faeser or Ahmad Mansour, the answer is obvious. Muslim Interactive called for a caliphate to replace German democracy. It spread anti-Semitism in a country that carries a specific, permanent historical responsibility to never let that happen again. It preached that religious law should override the rights of women. Banning that group is not an attack on Islam. It is the bare minimum a self-respecting democracy owes its own citizens, Muslims very much included, because the people most immediately harmed by extremist recruiters are often other Muslims. But if you are a 19-year-old born in Hamburg to a Turkish family, a kid who has never called for anything, who just prays and goes to school and scrolls the same feeds as everyone else, the picture from your window looks different. You see a permanent government task force with the name of your religion in its title. You see the oldest mosque networks in your city dissolved. You see the courts telling women in headscarves where they may and may not stand. You see the raids again and again, always framed around the same faith. And even if every single one of those actions is individually justified, the accumulation of them can leave you feeling like a permanent suspect in the only country you have ever called home. That feeling is real, whether or not any single ban was fair. And that feeling is precisely what the extremists are counting on. The story is not finished, either. On the same day Muslim Interactive was dissolved, two more groups, Generation Islam and Realitat Islam, had their properties raided as part of ongoing investigations into the same suspected network. Their fate is still unsettled, which means this exact debate, security versus suspicion, protection versus persecution, is going to keep replaying across Germany for years. So when a headline tells you that Germany just used another law against Islam, the honest answer is that it is both simpler and far more complicated than that. Germany used a very specific, very old constitutional weapon, one forged to protect a democracy from the forces that once destroyed it, and it aimed that weapon at a group openly demanding a caliphate. That is not the same thing as a war on a religion. But when you use that weapon over and over, and the name that keeps appearing in the headlines is always the same faith, you cannot be surprised when 5.5 million people start to wonder whether the line the government swears it is drawing is really as clear as the ministers claim. A democracy defending itself and a democracy alienating its own citizens are not opposites. Sometimes they are the exact same action, seen from two different windows. Germany believes it knows exactly where the line sits, between the extremist and the believer, between the caliphate and the mosque, between the threat and the neighbor. The hardest question in this whole story is not whether that line exists. It is whether the millions of people living on the wrong side of every raid can still feel it there at all. What do you think? Is Germany protecting its democracy or slowly turning an entire religion into a suspect? Drop your take in the comments, because this is one of those questions where the honest answers rarely agree.